Here are some practical tips I use that you should start using when it comes to ISO in photography. The first tip is to use the lowest ISO possible, as this will allow you to achieve the desired exposure. As we've been mentioning, lower ISO values generally produce images with less noise or grain and higher image quality. With that being said, I recommend that you start using the lowest ISO setting and only increasing it when necessary.
So if you watched the previous part in this ISO guide talking about common ISO values, one of the ISO ranges I provide is moderate ISO, which ranges from 400 to 800 ISO. And that range is usually good for when you're indoors and where the lighting isn't as bright as if you were outside. And so in this example here, I start with the lowest ISO in that range, which is ISO 400. My shutter speed is 1/160th and my aperture is at f1.8. So I start off here with ISO 400 and then I increase it to ISO 800 and ISO 1000. So as you can see, if you know the common ISO values, and then if you start at the lowest ISO first, you can work your way up. And in this case, I'd say around the ISO 800 mark is where it's properly exposed or exposed enough to where I like how it looks. So this is a great tip to remember. Just always start low and then just keep working your way up, keeping in mind the ISO ranges.
As we've touched on at the beginning of this guide, ISO is part of the exposure triangle along with shutter speed and aperture. With that being said, when adjusting ISO, consider how it will interact with your shutter speed and aperture based on your desired image results. For example, if you increase the ISO to capture more light, you may need to adjust your shutter speed or aperture to maintain proper exposure. But it may throw off another creative choice you had in mind, such as a blurred background with a wider aperture. So overall, it's important to balance all three of these elements of the exposure triangle.
When it comes to balancing all three elements of the exposure triangle, the three questions I always ask myself is, what do I want the depth of field to look like? Meaning, do I just want one focal point in focus or many? If it's just one focal point in focus, then I know I can use a wider aperture, and vice versa if I want everything in focus. The other question is whether or not the subject is moving, which will let me know if I need a fast or slower shutter speed. The last question is whether or not I have a tripod with me, or at least something to stabilize my camera against, as this will let me get away with using a slower shutter speed if needed. So starting out here, let's give the scenario that I just want to focus on the middle lens. So the first question that answers this is, I just want one focal point to be in focus. So with that being said, I want to use a wider aperture. So in this case, I have my aperture is set to f1.8. ISO is 800 and the shutter speed is 1/160th. So now let's say I wanted to include everything in focus, which means I will need to narrow the aperture. So I'm going to narrow the aperture to f5.6, but as we can see, it gets very dark and underexposed. So we need to either lower the shutter speed or increase the ISO to get more exposure into the image, or do both. So let's see. So since I'm on a tripod, I can afford to lower the shutter speed to 1/100th. If I wasn't on a tripod, then this would be risky because I might get lots of camera shake and blurry video. I'll also bump the ISO to 1250, and then I'll bump it up to ISO 1600, ISO 2000, and then all the way up to ISO 4000, and now we see the image is well exposed. Maybe a bit too overexposed, but exposed nonetheless. As you can see, there is also now some noise in the image because the ISO is very high, and let's say your camera can't handle these high ISO values. So if I wanted to bump down the ISO to get rid of grain, or just because my camera is not handling it well, I'll have to sacrifice having everything in focus with the narrow aperture and drop the aperture down to from f5.6 to f4.0. So now that I opened up the aperture a bit more, I can drop the ISO down now, since I don't need as much exposure. So I'd lower the ISO down to ISO 3200, ISO 2500, but it's a bit too dark. So ISO 3200 looks good. So knowing all the different elements of the exposure triangle and how they all balance out one another based on your creative goals is very important to know. And in case you're still learning about the exposure triangle, I'll create a guide on that in the future, so be sure to be on the lookout for that.
The third tip is to leverage your camera's light meter, which is built into most cameras. Your camera's light meter measures the amount of light in the scene and provides feedback on the exposure settings. With that being said, when using ISO, it's important to check and use your camera's light meter to ensure proper exposure and adjust the different elements in the exposure triangle to ensure that your indicator on the light meter still shows that your image is well exposed.
So as you can see here, I'm just demonstrating looking at the internal light meter and messing around with some ISO settings to see how the little marker in the light meter changes, letting you know whether or not the image is exposed or not. So this is just always something to look at while you're adjusting all of your exposure settings.
The fourth tip when using ISO is to consider using a tripod or propping your camera on something to stabilize it in situations where you need to use a higher ISO to capture enough light but want to minimize the noise. Doing this can help to reduce camera shake, which can contribute to increased noise in images, and will allow you to lower the shutter speed in case you have a high ISO but still need more exposure. The fifth tip is to post-process for noise reduction. If you do end up with noise or grain in your images, which happens at one point or another, consider using noise reduction techniques in post-production to help minimize the noise and improve your overall image quality. There are various post-processing software and tools you can use. For example, Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom have built-in tools to reduce the noise in the image, which I'll be touching on a bit more later.
So in the next part of this ISO guide, I'll be touching specifically on post-production techniques you can use to reduce some of the high noise and grain that's caused due to high ISO values. But I quickly wanted to touch on the most common technique in Adobe Lightroom, which I use, which is just using the noise reduction slider and some basic simple masks to quickly reduce noise and grain in an image. So as you can see with this image, there's very high noise and grain. This was actually shot with the Canon Rebel T6 about a few years back, and this is probably the case where I had the worst high ISO and grain in an image. As you can see, I was shooting at ISO 6400, which is very high ISO. So I quickly wanted to touch on in Adobe Lightroom. They did a great job of just having an actual noise reduction slider. So the thing with noise reduction is once you reduce noise, it reduces the grain and noise in the image. However, it smoothens out kind of the subjects. So if you have a subject or focal point in the image that you don't really want to be so smooth looking, then you can also apply sharpening, which I'll show you. So just go ahead and head here to the noise reduction slider, and then I'm going to bump it all the way up just so you can see how smooth it gets. So as you can see, the face shape, everything kind of turns into like that porcelain doll look, which isn't very good looking. So I'm just going to reduce it down to about maybe like 50 there. So as you can see, the grain and the noise is pretty much gone right away, kind of taking a look before and after looks. On the left is the before and the right's the after. So from here now, so you have kind of a smoother looking image. So I go up here and then I just increase the texture just a little bit, just to kind of bring back some of that sharpness. And then what you can do here is just head to the masking. And then if you select Lightroom now with their new update, makes it super easy to kind of isolate the different elements in your scene. So I'm going to just add a mask on the person here. Just hit create mask. And then let me just, so as you can see now, the overlay is showing that the subject is masked. So I'm just going to turn off the overlay. And I'm going to bump up the sharpness just on him to about 10. I'll bump it up all the way, or I always like to kind of go extremes and then bring it back just to see the boundaries and how far I can play it with it. So I'll bring it down to like about there, like 25. And then just close this mask, click in there, and then just zoom in, make sure it still looks fine. And you know, that's a really basic way. Let me bump up the shadows a little bit. And that's a really basic way just to kind of reduce noise really quickly, and then taking a look at the before and after. Very, as you can see, just, yeah, the noise and the grain is gone. And the subject now is in better detail. On the left, you can really see all that grain and stuff that was on his face. And yeah, that's a quick and easy way. As mentioned, I'll be creating a separate guide on post-production or editing out noise and grain, but that's a quick and easy way to do it, just using the noise reduction slider, texture, masks, and sharpness. Thanks for watching.